And it is so nice to be here. So part of the reason that we're moving to this mode is because I want to actually use some slides in a way that I like. It's a way that's pretty impactful, and it's certainly a way that helps illustrate the discussion we're going to have. And you've had a really interesting discussion so far. I mean, if you think about it, fundamentally, the way managers respond and react, coupled with a new, more contemporary definition of safety, those are probably exactly the ingredients that you guys need in the steel world or world steel, depending on how you call it, to actually move safety in a new direction, maybe reinvigorate a positive industrial safety program as it exists now. And that discussion is the one we want to have this morning, because this morning we're going to move through theory. And so a lot of the information I'm going to share with you, I want you to think about it pretty actively. Don't just accept it. Don't let it wash over you as fact, but in fact, listen and see what you think about the world and how this information impacts it. And I guess we could start with my opening slide. It's the slide I use pretty often to set the theme and to kind of model what I want to show for you. The very reason I've got us in this mode is to actually use this tool. So here's how I'm going to show some information to you. I just put some slides. I don't have very many, but I'm going to put them over my shoulder, and I want you to think about what you see. And my opening slide kind of sets the tone really for the next 2 days, for both today and tomorrow. And it helps us, well, it helps us start the discussion. Maybe that's a good way to say that, around looking at safety in a different way. Is that yeah, that's probably fair. Let me put it up and see what you think. Here is my opening slide. Read it carefully and be ready to process this information. Never take a sleeping tablet and a laxative. If you did not know this, this is really, today's been worth it so far already. If you did know it, we're sort of reinforcing what's happening. Now, let me tell you why I'm showing you this slide. I don't really have a story about this slide because that strikes me as kind of gross. That would be an awful thing to do. But what I want to do is tell you a little bit about the background. So a couple years ago, I wrote this book called Pre-Accident Investigation. And it did, well, first of all, I wrote it for work. Had I known anyone was going to read it, I promise you guys, I would have proofread it. I would have paid more attention. It went on to become one of the biggest selling safety books in the whole world, which sounds kind of like I'm bragging, but I promise you guys, I'm not bragging. To be one of the best selling safety books, you have to sell like 53. And my mom bought like 7. So she took me over the top. But nonetheless, I got invited to speak at a lot of meetings. And one of the meetings I got invited to speak at was a big American Society of Safety Professionals meeting in Las Vegas, Nevada. And there were 7,000 safety people. And I was the big keynote speaker, I had a couple-hour keynote, kind of like the discussion we're having today, right? And so I thought, well, I'm going to start with this slide because I can't think of a reason to not use this slide, especially in Las Vegas, Nevada, in the United States. It's the perfect slide for Las Vegas. So I popped the slide up there. It gets a pretty good response. It breaks the ice. And I'm getting ready to give the rest of my presentation. And I look up, and right in front of me, in the very far back of the room, there's a guy with his hand up. Now, I promise you guys, I never imagined in a million years anyone would ask a question about this slide. Like, to be honest, if I had a question about this slide, it's the kind of thing I probably would maybe Google privately. I certainly would not put my hand up in front of all my peers. And now I'm in this weird position where I don't know what to do. Like, a good presenter would ignore the guy and just move on because I had plenty of information. But if you ignore the guy, then you're not going to know what he's going to ask. And so I did the unthinkable. This is totally true, you guys. I stopped the meeting and I said, "Sir, do you have a question?" The guy stands up from across a crowded room and he says, "Does the order you take them in make a difference?" So I added this line, which I actually think makes the slide perfect. This is really the foundation for what we're going to talk about today. And the foundation's pretty interesting because one of the challenges we have, and I talked about it a little bit in the introduction, I even talked about it when we transferred over to this method, is that you guys are in a really interesting position where you've worked really hard for a long time to create very effective safety programs. In fact, if I were to draw a line, accidents over time, and animate that line, the story of safety in the steel industry, the very industry you guys represent, is not the story of countless failures. It's actually the story of progression, because we can't look at your performance and not compare it to the performance of 20, 30, 40 years ago. And 20 and 30, 40 years ago, performance was much, much different. And if you look at it now, well, if we drew the line, it would look like this. It would go down pretty aggressively, and you'd see a couple places where it plateaus out, and then it would be kind of plateaued. It would go to sort of a flat line, not at zero. And to be really honest with you guys, one of the things I would bring up is that the challenge you have now is that safety is harder to manage because events are harder to predict, which is completely normal. In fact, the better you get at preventing events, by definition, the fewer events you will have, or at least the less predictive the events you have become. Like in the old days, it was pretty easy to manage safety. If you had 5 hand cuts in a month, you had a hand safety problem, and you'd roll out a hand safety campaign all across the facility, and everybody would take hand safety training, and you'd solve your problem, at least for a while. But now you're not going to have 5 major hand cuts in probably 3 years, maybe 10 years, right? And so what once used to be really trendable and predictable, now it's not at all. And that's kind of what we want to talk about. It's certainly exactly what we want to talk about in this mode. And if you really looked at this journey you guys are on, I think I can define sort of 3 distinct periods of this trip. 2 of them you've already been on, and one of them is the journey you're thinking about next. And so let's start looking at this by starting with really the first effort that probably had the biggest impact. Now, I'm going to make a case that the biggest impact is earliest to make because the easy things get fixed first. But I would still nonetheless tell you that this journey starts squarely in the middle of compliance. Compliance is incredibly vital. In fact, compliance is the foundation upon which this discussion and all your safety discussions have to begin, because compliance really set the stage. In fact, I think about compliance like this: compliance told us what was acceptable. And in telling us what was acceptable, we also learned what was not acceptable. And compliance helped us communicate that level of acceptability, really not just at an individual facility or a mill or a plant. It helped us communicate that acceptability across wide swaths of the industry. And in World Steel, Carlos can talk about this in great detail. This has been a part of understanding things like unifying procedures and looking at rules and regulations. Some companies have like cardinal rules or golden rules. These are all compliance based activities. And what compliance does is it says, this is how to do this job. And then compliance reinforces or sometimes enforces people into doing the job in that way. And look at what compliance did. Look at this improvement. It's dramatic. I mean, events didn't just go down, they went down. They went way down. But then you'll see they kind of started leveling off. And that's an important thing for us to think about, because that leveling off period, well, that leveling off period helps us understand and really talk about compliance and some of its limitations. Now, I'll just be straight up with you. Compliance is effective and it's foundational, but it's also really difficult to sustain and brings with it some relatively severe limitations. There are 3. Can I make a 3? Let's do it this way. There are 3 limitations that I can think of right away. First and foremost is compliance has the ability to have an immediate impact, boom, but then it really has a difficult time sustaining that impact. So let me give you an example. So lots of times when I give this presentation and it's live, like back in the old days when we could actually see people, right? Remember those days? I would get up in front of a crowd of people and I would say this phrase: more rules do not equate into more safety. and usually people would clap. Sometimes grown men would cry. People would swoon. I'm not sure what that looks like, but let's go with it, right? And what I'm saying is that one rule is actually quite impactful. Three more instances of that rule isn't three times more impactful. So one rule that says no mobile phone while driving seems smart to me. I mean, that seems like a good rule. Three rules, a policy, a procedure, a process, and a cardinal rule that all say no mobile phone while driving does not make you three times less likely to have mobile phone while driving. So once the rule has set its standard, it no longer can reinforce its standard. So writing the rule again louder or slower or bigger doesn't actually make the rule more followable. Which brings us to the second limitation with compliance. And this is one I think about all the time. And that's the fact that compliance assumes there is one right way to do a job, which, uh, between you and I, is anyone listening? Between you and I, that's not always true. And in fact, compliance has a really difficult time managing normal operational variability because variability is difficult to plan for. And because it's difficult to plan for, it's difficult to write procedures for, and it's difficult to make rules for. And lots of times you guys are in a position, and I see this all the time, and so do you, where they can either follow the rule or do the work, but they are in a position where they cannot do both. And that gets a little funky. I mean, that gets a little difficult. And that's where they make nuanced decisions. And that's where the whole notion of violation of compliance is actually really difficult and not simple. And things like golden rules become really hard because sometimes, even sometimes, believe it or not, there's some nuance around the golden rules, which takes us to the number one limitation of compliance. And this one you're going to know. I mean, this is not going to be a surprise to you. And that is compliance is almost always an individual intervention. So we apply compliance one worker at a time. And I guess that's okay because we also gain hearts and minds one worker at a time. We monitor behavior one worker at a time. All of these things look at the worker, the individual worker, and we say that worker, well, that worker is an issue. You heard me say it before, but one of the challenges is if we define safety as the worker as a problem that needs to be controlled, then compliance becomes a really important tool because it helps us control that problem. The challenge is you can't be everywhere at once. So compliance requires enforcement, observation, coaching, counseling, training, testing, credentialing, all those things. You know them all. I don't have to listen to you. And the problem is, as our organizations get larger and leaner and more geographically distributed, it becomes more and more difficult to manage compliance one worker at a time. And so as it started leveling out, and you can kind of put a time frame on this. If you look at where compliance really rolled out, we're probably talking 25, 30 years ago. In your industry, that's probably fair. The steel industry, I think, struggled with compliance at first, but once it got on board, man, it got on board with both feet. But then you started seeing it level out. That plateau, that middle plateau, the one that's right there. You can see it. It's right there, right? That middle plateau started to introduce a relatively new idea. So within the last 20, 15, 10 years. And that's the idea of safety by design. So we started looking at systems and we said, we can engineer a lot of problems out of a system and make it safer to do the job. If we design the job better, that takes away the high need for compliance. So our organizations would say compliance would lift the heavy lifting for the individual worker. Safety by design, or process safety, it's often called, that actually would create a system where it's easier to do the job right than it is to do the job wrong. Easier to do the job safely than it is to do the job dangerously. And what's amazing is that dropped us again. And if you looked at that second part of the journey, that record-breaking improvement cliff you see us dropping down on, that safety by design part made a huge difference. It made a huge difference. But design also has some pretty significant limitations. And one of the limitations of design, and it's just flatly a limitation of design, is that in fact, it's really expensive. It's really expensive. In fact, it costs a ton of money to engineer out all the hazards from a facility. And I would make a case, and you'd probably be right there with me, that not all the hazards need to be engineered out. That's not as vital because it is so incredibly expensive. We can count on workers to make decisions. So now we're in a position where not everything could be designed out, and it was really expensive to design it out. And so that put us one more time into the current line we're in now. And you can see it, it's this big flat line right here. That line represents the reason that you guys called me. That line is this sort of low level number of events that are happening globally that no matter what we do, just continue to happen. And I guess the question you'd ask is, well, why do they happen? Well, to answer that, I think we have to turn to arithmetics, to math. I hate to because it's really scary to go to math, but I think we should. There's a name for a curve that goes dramatically down and then levels out, never gets to zero. There's a name for this curve, and this curve is present in all sorts of processes. So if you were going to make salt water, I don't know why you'd make salt water, but let's just go with that. Okay. Your assignment is to make salt water. At some point, when you put salt in, the water is no longer going to get any saltier. You're going to reach a point where you've saturated the water with all the salt that water will carry. That point, if you represented the curve, water versus salt, that point where it starts to flatten out, that point has a name. And I love this name because it sounds kind of naughty. It sounds dirty, but you can say this anywhere because it's not naughty or dirty. And that is called an asymptote. And in fact, this curve you see behind my head is an asymptotic curve. And what an asymptotic curve tells us is that your current strategy has saturated your process. And that's right where we are on our safety journey. Our water won't take any more salt. We have said you can do compliance harder. You can spend more money on design, but it's not busting through that last 5% or that last 10%, that most difficult ending to get us to where we want to go to on whatever our journey is, on however we define safety. And that's where we have to look at one more paradigm shattering, asymptote breaking challenge, change. And so what happened, at least in my case, is my bosses got together and they're really smart. And they said, we're in an asymptote. Doing more of the same is not getting us any better results. We've got to bust through that asymptote, go search for what's happening next. And so we put together a little team, a whole bunch of us, and we traveled around the world and we thought about this a lot. And we said, compliance focuses on the individual worker. Okay, fair enough. And design, process safety focuses on the system, obviously. Maybe we should look at the place where the work meets the system, the socio-technical interface. Socio meaning people, technical meaning the system, the socio-technical interface. And that's when we started to look at human and organizational performance. And what's interesting is that human and organizational performance really allowed us the ability to look not at compliance only or design only, but in a much more holistic way, look at the place where the work meets the worker. And what's remarkable is if you start looking at the place where the work meets the worker, it kind of changes the way you think about safety. In fact, I would suggest traditional safety, safety as we've known it, that traditional safety model no longer is terribly impactful. Let me show you what I mean. Traditional safety is defined pretty simply. You can see it. The worker is the problem to be controlled. The worker is the problem to be fixed. We make safety better by making workers be more safe. We train them, we coach them, we enforce them, we counsel them, we observe them. This is all really that compliance-based view, and we get them to be better by making them individually, one at a time, be more safe. And the way we do that is we tell workers what to do, or oftentimes what we do is tell workers what not to do. And we measure and define safety by the absence of injury, by the absence of harm. I think that one says by the absence of accidents. Now, this view isn't wrong. In fact, this view got us to where we are today. The challenge is that this view really puts us in a position where we're building very robust systems that want to prevent all bad things from going wrong. You heard me say it already. It's really risky to say, but the notion that every accident is preventable is a fundamental tenet of traditional safety. The problem is that once you get the organization completely aligned around preventing all things from going wrong, the organization really isn't ready for when the inevitable things that do go wrong go wrong. And so this notion of Volvo, the car company, right, or failing safely, or those guys in Thailand with the big piece of equipment, that becomes really difficult to understand because the event happened and the organization failed to prevent it. Human performance really allows us to look a little differently. And this is the part that you're here for. In fact, this is what we're talking about today. And that is the worker's not the problem to be controlled or fixed. The worker's actually the problem solver. You will not get to the next level of performance, the performance that your company really wants to get to, by assuming the worker has to be fixed. What you want to do is engage the worker's knowledge of your systems and processes in order to create improvement. So you don't tell your people what to do or what not to do. You actually ask them what they need. And you define safety much differently. Safety all of a sudden isn't the absence of accidents. It's not the absence of injuries. It's not the absence of harms. That's an outcome. Safety for you guys is actually the presence of capacity, the presence of controls, the presence of systems, the presence of safeguards. And what's remarkable about that is that that actually moves the entire organization not away from prevention, but actually to include assurance. Because the bottom line, you guys, and we can talk all day long. In fact, it's going to feel like we do. Okay, just be ready for that. It's only 2 days, though. We'll make it through, right? The bottom line is that your guys mostly do high-risk work into all kinds of conditions with all kinds of hazards, successfully, safely, on time, within scope, within quality specs, and on budget. So if they mostly are doing good things, why don't we build a system that actually assures the good things continue to happen? So you move from that prevention bias towards more of a resilience bias. You move from robust systems to robust and resilient systems. And that challenge is exactly where we want to be on this journey. But it means ultimately we have to redefine safety. So when Volvo says they're going to make a fatality-free car, they're not saying they're going to make a car that won't crash. In fact, it's quite the opposite. They know the car is going to crash. There's a 100% probability the car's going to wreck. And when it does crash, they've built a car that has enough safeguards, enough controls, enough barriers, enough systems that it has the ability to actually crash successfully. That car has enough capacity. And you're going to hear me talk a lot about capacity. Well, I've already talked a lot about capacity, but capacity is a big part of this discussion because what you manage is not failure. Failure is pretty common. In fact, failure happens all the time. In fact, let's just say it. In your industry, the steel industry, events happen all the time. It's just that most of the events that happen in such a way that your guys in the field, on the floor, detect and correct them before they have high levels of consequence. Consequence to safety, consequence to environment, consequence to quality, consequence to production. I about can't say those words, right? The crazy thing is that already exists. And what human and organizational performance does is it helps you understand fundamentally that space where the work meets the worker. Human and organizational performance is the individual worker working within the organization's systems to meet the expectations that the organization has. That is our definition of the new view of human and organizational performance. But to get there, we ought to think about something a little bit deeper. So let me see if I can describe what it's like to work for you. Now, I could be wrong because I've been wrong on a lot of stuff. I mean, it is not uncommon for me to be wrong. But this description, I think, is relatively interesting. I think your guys, the guys that work for you all across the globe, are as safe as they want to be, as they need to be. Okay. And the reason I can say that is because generally speaking, people don't come to work to get safe. And if you're hiring people that come to work to get, I'm sorry, people don't come to work to get injured. That's a better, that was a Freudian slip, right? And if you're hiring people that come to work and want to get injured, you're really bad at human resources and picking people to hire. The most vast, greatest majority of your workers are safe as they need to be, right? Without being overly safe in order to be productive. So let me say this again because I kind of lost myself in the Freudian slip I had, but I think it's worth talking about that. In fact, workers are as safe as they need to be because once they're safe, they don't need to be more safe without being too safe because it doesn't really pay to be overly safe. In fact, being overly safe is expensive. It eats a lot of time and it's inefficient. And they do all of this to be productive. Now, what I've just described for you is really the tension that exists between doing work and being safe. And the amazing thing about that tension between doing work and being safe is that there really is no line that defines one from the other. In fact, I would say if there were a line, it's constantly in motion and it's really fuzzy. This is a big part of what we should talk about. And in fact, let me tell you a little sidebar story as we progress through. So I'm giving this presentation, I don't know, a couple months ago, I guess. And a lady, just like this, a lady on a Zoom call. There weren't as many people on this call, maybe only like 9 people or something, 8 people. This lady in the middle block of the Zoom, I can see her right here. She actually just turns her mic on and she said, "This slide is offensive," just like that. And I said, "Wow, really? This slide offended you?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Wow. I was really worried about the laxative slide. I mean, I thought that one would trip your trigger, but that one did nothing. This is the one that got you." And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Why? Talk to me. Tell me why. Let's discuss this." And then I said, "Steel on steel, steel sharpens steel," which I'm not saying just for you guys, although it does fit pretty well in a cool thing to say in a world steel workshop. But I said, "Steel on steel, steel sharpens steel. Tell me, let's talk about it." And she looked me in the eye through the computer and she said, "At my workplace, you can never be too safe." Huh. What would you say to her if you were me? Now, what I wanted to say to her was, "When's the last time you touched a tool?" But somehow you guys, that felt kind of snotty and rude and kind of weird. So instead, I said, "Well, let's talk about this a bit because I actually think there really is a line where you can be overly safe, and that line is not something you want your workers to cross or your workers want to cross." And I said, "Maybe I can illustrate it this way." And so I looked at her. This is all through Zoom, right? And I said, "Did you drive to work this morning?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "How did you know while you were driving you were safe enough?" And she looked at me and she said, "Well, I got to work safely." And I said, "Well, that's a really good answer. I appreciate it greatly. I mean, that's perfect. The problem is that's not the answer to the question I asked. You actually answered a different question. The question you answered it is, how did you know you were safe enough after you parked your car in the parking lot and drove to work this morning? But I didn't ask that question. I asked, how do you know you're safe enough while you're driving? And she said, well, I follow the rules. I said, okay, does that ensure safety? No, she says. I drive a good car. Does that ensure safety? She said, I leave appropriate distance between me and the car in front of me. I said, but does that ensure safety? And she said, well, no, because the one thing I'm not in charge of is the behavior of every other driver on the road. I'm only in charge of my own behavior. And then she looked at me and she said, I mean, I guess the answer to your question, how do I know I'm safe enough while I'm driving to work, is I don't. And I said, so is that an okay answer? Because I could easily replace the word driving with the word working. And we could ask this for any worker that works for you. And she said, no, I'm very uncomfortable with that. And I said, maybe we should talk about this because this, I think, is an important, it's an important maturity point for the way everybody's thinking about safety across the globe. So there's a couple things that I think this driving illustration really illustrates nicely. The first one is the idea that hazards themselves are not permanent. That hazards, and those are the things that can hurt you or hurt your workers, they're really dynamic. And that risk itself, because risk is a combination of hazard and the distance away from that hazard, risk itself is incredibly dynamic. In fact, when you drive your car, it's not one task with one set of hazards. It's actually a whole bunch of tasks with a whole bunch of set of hazards. In fact, it's probably thousands of micro tasks, maybe even tens of thousands of micro tasks that happen. And what's amazing is that this relationship between production and safety isn't like a balance. It's not like a scale. It's not like one is high and the other is low and the other is low and the other is high. They're really more like a relationship that couples to one another. And so when you drive to work, it's a pretty good bet that when you're driving to work, part of your drive is kind of boring, right? There's not much going on. And so what happens is in those places, your controls are probably lower. But there are other parts of your drive where it's actually really, really complicated. There's lots going on. There's a big, scary corner that you can't see around. There, your controls would be high. And the case I'd make for you guys early in this discussion is that as a company, you don't really manage risk. And yet, any risk that you identify that you can mitigate, you should. I mean, don't get me wrong. If there's a sharp thing at eye level, you should remove it, right? But the risks that your workers deal with on a day in and day out basis, you don't really get to manage that risk. That risk is constantly in motion. It's dynamic. It's like the waves of an ocean. It's moving in and out, in and out. And your workers are trying to find their way in those waves. And that harmonious finding of the way, that's really what we want to think about. The quick answer is, and we'll talk about this a lot more tomorrow, is that I want to build a case that you couple risk with control. And so where once we used to identify the hazards, and we actually thought that was enough. And I have to tell you, I think that work has helped us a lot. I mean, it made us better. The problem is I'm not sure the hazard's what we control. What we control is the capacity. What we control are the barriers and safeguards, tools, controls, the things that make the work fail better. Those are the things that actually allow us to have that control. So the example I think of before I lose you too far is if it's raining really hard tonight when you drive home, it's going to take you longer to get home. Why? Well, here's the answer. The reason it's going to take you longer to get home is because you're not going to go as fast because it's raining. So you're going to give up some efficiency to gain some control. And you do that not based upon effectiveness of the drive home. You always want that to be effective. It's based upon really the presence of risk. The quick answer is we used to believe that what we managed was risk. And I used to be scared of super high risk work. But now what I've learned is that what we really manage are controls. And high risk work that has really good controls isn't that scary. Arc events and high voltage used to scare me a lot, but now if we use the right people, the right equipment with the right tools, the right training and right experience, it's a pretty safe job. What scares me is high risk work where there aren't controls. And part of that is understanding how hazards happen and the relationship with hazards and the dynamic nature of hazards and how risk is constantly in motion. So all of a sudden, what used to be a very linear, predictable way, write a procedure and hold workers to compliance, has a really difficult time managing failure because workers are as safe as they need to be without being overly safe in order to be productive until they're not. And that's what we want to think about. Because what we're going to talk about, at least in this little workshop, is this notion of how we handle failure. And failure is a pretty significant part of how we move forward. In fact, one of the challenges you have is that when something bad happens, we want to traditionally look at how we failed to prevent the bad thing from taking place. So if a ship gets crosswise in the Suez Canal, right? It's like a giant piece of cheese in the Earth's colon. Sorry for that example, but it just popped into my head and I went with it. Topical though, because you steel guys are nothing if you're not topical. It's easy to look at that and say, wow, that failure happened. That failure is a function of a bad person doing a bad thing. And part of what we have to talk about early when we talk about failure is the way the organization responds to failure. Because if you're going to understand failure, the first thing we have to understand is how you guys react to failure. And by saying you guys, I mean you guys, the people that are having the workshop right now, us, but I also mean you guys, the teams, the leaders at the mid level, the leaders at the field level, the leaders at the senior level, how the organization responds. Because the belief somehow that a worker did something wrong and therefore it caused the organization to have the failure, coupled with the belief that we are to prevent every bad thing from happening, almost builds the perfect storm for us to look at an event and determine that a bad person did something bad and we didn't prevent it as an organization. And then what happens is we do an entire setup around the ability to stop an event that already happened. We draw a wish list of all the things we wish would have happened that didn't happen that created the event. And normally in this workshop, I show a video, but it doesn't work that well for technical reasons of a guy who gets his head bit with an alligator. He's working in an alligator wrestling show, right? I mean, that's his job. And the big finish of every single show is they open the alligator's mouth and he sticks his head in and then he pulls it out and stands up and takes a bow. And this works perfectly until it doesn't. And the time when it failed is the time when he forgot to wipe a piece of sweat off his forehead. He stuck his head in the alligator's mouth. The sweat dripped off his forehead. It hit the inside of the alligator's mouth, which triggered a neuroreaction, a natural biological reaction. The alligator snaps his mouth shut and bites the guy's head. Now, the guy didn't die, right? It's not even bloody. In fact, eventually a bunch of guys run out and crank open the mouth of the alligator, and the alligator lets the guy loose, and he walks away. Now, you can look at that and say, that guy's crazy. I mean, that guy's nuts because, well, first of all, he sticks his head in the alligator's mouth, and I'm relatively certain, although I don't know this for sure, you guys can maybe tell me, but I'm relatively certain alligators have bad breath because my guess is they just eat dead chickens. Although I said that the other day, and somebody said in a workshop, that's all we eat too are dead chickens, but then it feels different because we cook them. We can talk about that later. You can look at that and say the guy who stuck his head in the alligator's mouth was risky, was foolish, right? It took a chance, was crazy. He was out there on the edge. And that'd be true. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. That's true. However, I would suggest that really what the guy that stuck his alligator or his head in the alligator's mouth was doing was his job. It's really not a lot different than working with radioactive material like at my place or molten metal at your places, right? I mean, or high risk height or speed or pinch points. Hazards are hazards. What's remarkable is when you look at that story and think about the failure, our initial response is to say the person failed because the person screwed up. Now, that's got a name, and the name for that is the fundamental attribution disorder. But the problem with the fundamental attribution disorder is that it's just that it's a disorder. And the disorder says we look first to the person, and if we find a reason why the system failed and the person did it, then we no longer need to look deeper in the system. And the question you want to ask is if a guy doing his normal job, and his normal job includes sticking his head in the alligator's mouth, gets bit, did the guy fail or did the organization fail? And that question is an important question. And maybe the best way to illustrate that is to tell you one more sidebar story. So you heard a little bit in the introduction of what I do. So I worked at this big national laboratory, and I worked in an office called the Safety and Health Initiative Office, which actually originally we submitted the name Safety and Health Initiative Team because we use acronyms to describe all our groups, and that would have been the perfect acronym. However, they caught it at the very end because it spells kind of a naughty word, and they said we couldn't have it, and then they renamed us office. So that's how you get to be Safety and Health Initiative Office, which spells nothing. And we get to do lots of investigations. And I've done investigations all around the world, a lot of them, a bunch of investigations. And one time I was doing a really big investigation for a high explosive failure. And in the midst of this high explosive failure, and we'd been working on it for weeks because these guys dropped the largest piece of high explosive they've ever made, and it did not blow up. And they dropped it a meter, a little bit more than a meter, into gravel. And gravel's really a goofy thing to drop high explosives in because gravel's got a lot of pointy edges, and pointy edges cause friction, and friction is the enemy of high explosives. And normally it would make a big explosion, but it didn't. It was remarkable. It did not explode. Now, here's what's crazy about this is in the midst of that investigation, another event happened. Right down the road from where we were doing our investigation, there was a really big train crash. And what happened is a small commuter rail, a small light rail train, had a head on collision with a full blown freight train, a Class A freight train, at 41 and a half miles an hour. It happened in a place called Chatsworth, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. And what happened is the light rail, the small train, was on the same track as the large train going in opposite directions. So they were heading for each other. But that's kind of normal. That happens almost every single day. But in the midst of this event, the driver, the operator of the small train, was sending a text message. He was texting. I have to move my thumbs, international sign of texting. He was sending a text message and he missed the red signal, blew straight through the red signal, didn't even stop, didn't even hit the brakes, and had a head on collision with that freight train at 41 and a half miles an hour. It instantly killed 26 people and eventually killed 28, including the operator, including the person texting. It was a horrific accident, devastating accident, a horrible, horrible accident. It was a failure of reliability, and it was a failure with significant consequence. And what's interesting is the reason they called us is because the team had become fixated on texting. So let me ask you a question. It's just a thought question. There's too many of us in the room to answer this question, but let me ask it for you anyway. Are you ready? Is texting the reason this crash happened? Okay, let me re-ask that. I asked it wrong. Is operator inattention due to texting the reason this crash happened? Is that better?
In my
Ah,
opinion,
so
no.
some of you absolutely and completely understand that the answer to that is no. In fact, as egregious as texting sounds, and it's pretty egregious. I mean, it's a provocative. It is really, in fact, it's the definition of a provocative failure. The crazy thing is you could replace texting with virtually anything. I mean, a bumblebee in the cab of the locomotive, a snake on a train. Just thinking about that, just kicking that one out there, right? Nude sunbathers on either side of the track, right? A heart attack, anything that would have distracted the operator from that red light would have been the problem. And the challenge becomes in that fundamental attribution disorder. The challenge is how do we react to that failure? Now, I started the class by saying how management reacts colors the way the organization will move forward. Here's where the payoff comes for that. Because the question I sort of secretly led you to, kind of through a twisty and turn series of weak stories, you were just there, so you know where we went. The question I led you to is this one: why didn't the engineer stop at the red light? But I actually think that's not the right question. I think the right question is, why didn't the red light stop the train, stop the engineer? And in fact, one of the lessons that we have to learn is not the presence of failure, but the absence of controls. So let me say something. You might write this down, and it's really simple, and you're going to know it, but even the choir needs practice. So here's what I'm going to say to you. Never let your workers be one layer of defense away from failure. If the only defense you have for the worker not getting hurt or not dying or not having a quality problem or not having an environmental problem or not having a production problem, because you guys manage a lot of critical things, if the only defense you have is that the worker will do the job perfectly, then that system will fail. It's not a matter of if it fails, it will fail. You have your own alligator wrestling show. You've got your own place where workers are sticking their heads in alligators, and you're going to be surprised when they get their head bit, and you're going to say, how stupid could they be? That notion of a single point failure, we're going to talk about that as an operator dependent safety system. And the one thing we know is that an operator dependent safety system will fail. Guaranteed. No question about it. It will fail. We just don't know when. And the reason it will fail is because people aren't perfect. And if we build systems that expect perfect people to respond perfectly, and that's the only control we put in that system, and don't look at me like you don't do this, because I know if I walked around your facility, I'd find places where you had single point failures. Those are incredibly weak places in your system. And this drives a tremendous amount of what we talk about, is that in fact, this idea that we expect the worker to perform perfectly, to be obedient, to follow the procedure, that fundamentally is flawed because we put imperfect workers into that position. Drivers, one of the things you said when I said, what is the most important safety feature in a vehicle? You guys all said drivers, right? And drivers are amazing. They're fundamentally important to vehicle safety. They're everything to vehicle safety, while simultaneously the least reliable control system in a car. Your workers are brilliant at solving problems, brilliant at it. They're amazing at it. The problem is they're not consistent in their brilliance, because human beings are ultimately fallible. Think of it kind of like this. This is my picture of a sharp stick. And at the very pointy end of the stick are your workers, right?